Hello, and thank you all very much for having me here with you. It's an absolute pleasure to share a bit with you about drinking in the Civil War. And today I'd like to begin with a tale of a Union general rumored extensively to be a drunkard. People worried that his drinking affected his judgment on the battlefield. Whispers got louder, catching the ears of military officials. Would his drinking bring about the downfall of the Union? That was the question on everyone's mind. And if you're thinking you know who this general is, you're probably right. People were questioning the character of General Irwin McDowell. His name obviously is familiar to Civil War enthusiasts, history teachers, maybe students who are taking a Civil War class. But he's certainly not the first general who comes to mind when someone brings up the Civil War, and probably not the first general who comes to mind when someone brings up drinking in the Civil War. McDowell was a graduate of West Point who had had a long career as a staff officer in the United States Army. He was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He had friends in very high places. And in 1861, he was promoted to brigadier general and placed in command of the Army of Northeastern Virginia. And Wikipedia, our very trusted source, says he is best known, I like that they do that, he is best known for his defeat in the First Battle of Bull Run. And that's why I'm bringing him to your attention today. The First Battle of Bull Run was one of the first major engagements in the Civil War. It occurred July 21st, 1861. And the short version of the story is that for the Federals or Union troops, Bull Run did not go well. Federals were supposed to defeat Confederate forces and put down the rebellion in one swoop. Instead, they were unprepared and they got whooped, to use the highly technical term. I'm not planning to go into the particulars of the battle today. I only bring it up because of poor McDowell. Shortly after the disaster at Bull Run, rumors began to circulate, and not just the rumor that he was incompetent. Rumor was that the Federals lost the battle because McDowell was drunk. And this wasn't the first time that people had gossiped about McDowell's drinking. He was a very bumbling man. His face often blushed. A year later, in 1862, when McDowell was defeated again at the Second Battle of Bull Run, the rumors went crazy. Soldiers called McDowell a traitor. A court of inquiry investigated his conduct. What I think is noteworthy about this rumor of drunkenness is that there was no truth to it in McDowell's case. In fact, one observer remarked that the general had never tasted anything stronger than a watermelon in all his life. He was such a teetotaler that some soldiers in German regiments considered him obnoxious, because he objected to the barrels of lager and the cases of wine and liquors because they increased the wagon trains and delayed movements. So committed was McDowell to temperance that in one case, after he fell off his horse while reviewing troops, the staff surgeon tried to get some brandy into his mouth, but McDowell set his teeth rigidly. When the general regained consciousness, he proudly noted that brandy could not be forced down his throat, even when he was not in control of his faculties. So if McDowell wasn't a drinker, why did rumors persist about his drunkenness? Well, I would argue they're part of a larger pattern that existed during the war in both the Union and the Confederacy. During the war, civilians and soldiers alike were looking for moral heroes who could fight for their cause. And among civilians, especially temperance reformers, there was this notion that sobriety and success went hand in hand. And likewise, or conversely, so did failure and drunkenness. Commanding officers who were widely known to be teetotalers were assumed to be successful militarily. And on the other hand, men who failed often had their sobriety questioned. This is what happened to General McDowell. And this is the phenomenon I like to explore more fully in this talk. The notion that sober men were also successful men had its roots in the early years of the Republic, decades before the Civil War. Early Americans believed that representative government couldn't thrive without public servants who were virtuous. Drunkards could corrupt the nation. And as the United States expanded voting rights for white men in the early 19th century, this idea persisted. Drunken voters were dangerous. They were easily bribed and swayed, and they threatened democracy. The emergence of factories raised the stakes even higher. Factory owners argued that drunken workers couldn't produce reliably. Men who drank wasted their wages on liquor, and their wives and children went hungry. You could add to the mix the rising popularity of evangelical Christianity that was happening in the same decades. American evangelicals believed that they could find evidence of their salvation in their ability to perfect themselves, which included the ability for complete self-control. Drunkenness, I think as some of us know, is the antithesis of self-control. So putting this all together, on the eve of the Civil War, there are plenty of Americans who believed that sobriety led to success. Personal success, American success, and eternal salvation. Drinking, on the other hand, was a slippery slope to ruin, both individual and national. Once the war broke out in 1861, the preservation of the Union, or alternatively, independence for the Confederacy, hinged on men's successes, and sobriety became essential, especially at the highest ranks. As the Journal of the American Temperance Union put it, treason can be punished with death, while drunkenness secures all the results of treason and goes unpunished. Drunkenness had worsened the present national calamity by creating a group of officers so incompetent that they presided over the grossest blunders in the management and the most disheartening and murderous defeats in battle. When it came to saving the Union, Northerners began the war with two clearly sober moral heroes, Generals Neal Dow and Oliver Otis Howard. Both men had been temperance reformers for decades before the war, and their cold water bona fides were absolutely impeccable. Neal Dow seemed the perfect example of moral manhood when he was appointed colonel of the 13th Maine in 1861. In the early 1850s, Dow had led the state of Maine's crusade for prohibition. Maine reformers believed that soldiers under his command would be men of true temperance principles, prompt, efficient, and orderly. They even likened the regiment to one of Oliver Cromwell's. The men had united faith and works in their noble struggle against outraged tyranny. And in that case, they mean both rebels, the tyranny of the Confederacy and secession, and the tyranny of drunkenness. It works two ways. So under Dow's leadership, these sober soldiers would find success. For his part, Dow became the eyes and ears of the Journal of the American Temperance Union, corresponding regularly with updates on the state of morality among the troops. He applauded reformers' efforts and encouraged them as they worked diligently to rid the Union Army of that terrible enemy to the soldier, which kills far more of them than fall in battlefield. Again, the enemy he's referring to is not Confederate soldiers, but is absolutely liquor. So temperance reformers were not surprised when Dow was promoted to brigadier general. But when he was relegated to a command at Ship Island, Mississippi, they complained about the lack of opportunity that position offered him. And they concluded that wine and brandy drinking officers had colluded to thrust him into the background away from military action because they hated his temperance principles. Even after Dow was captured and imprisoned in Richmond, reformers worried, for undoubtedly his imprisonment was humiliating and trying. Dow's strong anti-slavery principles exposed him to the deep hatred of the rebels, according to temperance reformers, and they worried that his temperance principles would expose him to the cold shoulder of his fellow officers. Dow became an important representative for the temperance cause during the war because he fought two enemies, rebels and northern drunkards. And any misfortunes he experienced from the perspective of temperance reformers came from those threatened by his unwavering temperance rather than any personal or professional shortcomings. And the state of Maine, it seems, had no shortage of examples of morality and sobriety. Oliver Otis Howard was commander of the 3rd Maine when the war began, and he eventually took command of the Army of the Tennessee in 1864. Howard hated two things, drunkenness and profanity. He considered these two vices to be the worst enemies that Union soldiers would encounter. Again, worse, at least in his rhetoric, than Confederate soldiers. Howard's intolerance for both made him a really useful ally of chaplains and of reformers. They had little trouble convincing him to prohibit the commissary from selling any of the rum, which was probably, according to reformers, full of poisonous strychnine. And Howard also won plaudits from abstainers on the home front who were willing to overlook his military shortcomings. Early in the war, Howard gained notoriety for fighting bravely, first at the Battle of Fair Oaks, where he was seriously wounded, and then at Fredericksburg. Howard earned the confidence of Union officials, and he replaced Franz Sigel as commander of the 11th Corps shortly before the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863. After a disastrous Union performance, many Northerners blamed the German-American soldiers of the 11th Corps, including Division Commander Carl Schurz. They bore the blame for being routed by Stonewall Jackson's famous flank attack during Chancellorsville's battle. But temperance reformers took little notice of Howard's involvement with the disaster. They criticized General Joseph Hooker, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but their only mention of Howard's role in the battle came near the end of the war, when they noted that his name was, quote, brilliantly associated with Chancellorsville, as well as every other engagement with which he had been involved. Reformers were enthralled by his consummate bravery, his established integrity, and his Christian fortitude. The general, according to them, had been stamped as one of God's own men. That neither Howard nor Dow commanded sober soldiers to incredibly decisive victories really registered with temperance reformers. They always blamed suspected drunken men around Howard and Dow for any shortcoming that might have befallen them. Confederates, for their part, looked for moral heroes that would turn the tide of war in their favor as well. But early in the war, they had to work pretty diligently to turn what I think we would consider shady characters into upright officers. And an interesting example of their recrafting efforts was General John B. Floyd, the former Secretary of War under James Buchanan. Floyd had been accused of fraud and treason against the United States during the 1850s as the secession crisis unfolded. But shortly before the war began in 1861, the Richmond Dispatch published a piece on Floyd lauding his bravery and military sagacity. He had not made a single mistake in fighting at the Battle of Carnifex Ferry in Virginia. As for his personal habits, the paper noted that Floyd neither drinks nor gambles nor uses profane language. He treated his soldiers and officers with respect and care, and he didn't allow them to injure any private or public property. Virginians, the editors believed, could look on Floyd as a protector and a patriot who would be successful in time in driving the enemy from their soil. John Floyd turned out to be a poor choice for a military hero. Less than a year later, in February 1862, Floyd turned tail and ran with several of his regiments when the Confederate surrender of Fort Donelson was imminent. Virginia's hero pretty quickly became a laughingstock. The Confederates really didn't have to waste any time replacing Floyd with much better models of military and moral manhood. Generals Thomas Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, names that are much more familiar to us today. And before I go further, I do want to note that the images of both Jackson and Lee have been manipulated by hagiographers since the war's end. Both generals' moral characteristics have been amplified by lost cause enthusiasts who are very focused on presenting Confederate heroes as morally upright. That being said, both men's aversion to liquor has been well noted by historians, and soldiers and civilians during the 1860s also praised the generals and actually took pains to follow their examples. Jackson's fervent Presbyterian faith and strong penchant for cold water, actually in his case as a beverage and a curative, those were well known among Confederates. And from the time he was a young man at West Point, Jackson avoided liquor. This was partly for health reasons. He followed a bland diet. He really drank mostly water. But according to a few of Jackson's friends, he reportedly liked the taste of whiskey quite a bit and avoided it because he feared he would turn into a drunkard if he imbibed too regularly. During the war, Confederates were captivated by his dietary oddities. A friend's encounter with Jackson left Charles Minor Blackford, who was an officer in the Army of Northern Virginia, absolutely fascinated. Although the man offered General Jackson every variety of strong drink, Jackson accepted only buttermilk. And according to Blackford, his refusing to take something stronger did not lower him in his friend's estimation. Instead, it emphasized his admiration. Lee avoided the bottle as well. From the time he was a young man, Lee seems to have purposefully set out to avoid some of his father, Light Horse Harry Lee's misfortunes, consciously choosing to emulate his mother's evangelical habits rather than his father's reckless ones. But even though Lee chose a life of self-control, his conversion to teetotalism was a gradual evolution. In the decades before the Civil War, Lee, though a non-drinker himself, continued to follow Virginian patterns of hospitality, serving wine and spirits to house guests. But over time, Lee had decided that providing liquor merely facilitated bad habits, and he stopped. He especially believed that spirituous liquors and military service were a volatile mix. 2 years before the war began, Lee stressed the dangers of consuming liquor to his son, Fitz Lee, who was preparing to depart for military service. The deprivations of army life would increase temptations to drink, at least in part because there would be nothing else to pass the time. Lee feared that soldiers thought of ardent spirits as a substitute for every luxury, and he wasn't really wrong about that. The elder Lee knew that strong drink would often be offered as a form of hospitality, but he urged his son to avoid whiskey altogether because its temperate use is so difficult. In this regard, Lee was not unlike Jackson. And their belief that an occasional drink of whiskey would eventually lead a man down the slippery slope to drunken ruin puts them firmly in the camp of other temperance reformers. Confederate soldiers listened to Lee, and they used him for inspiration in their own attempts to practice self-restraint. On the inside cover of his diary, Confederate John Baxter Mosley fastened a newspaper clipping featuring a quotation from Robert E. Lee. "Whiskey. I like it. I always did. And that is the reason I never use it." Now, whether Lee said this or not, that part's unclear. But Mosley was committed to remaining sober throughout the conflict. And he seemingly kept that quotation to remind him every day to follow the example of Lee, a great Confederate leader and a moral person. Many soldiers and civilians agreed when it came to drinking, moderation was difficult. And in the ranks, a soldier could best do his duty if he avoided liquor altogether. Having high-ranking officers to emulate made that goal of abstinence easier to achieve, and an army of teetotaling soldiers led into battle by a sober general would certainly bring about victory. On the other hand, a drunken general could certainly engender defeat. And so when generals performed poorly on the battlefield, civilians began to chatter about whether or not those commanders were also drunk. This had been the problem for McDowell, our first example in this talk. He lost twice. People gossiped that he was drunk. The idea that he might have just been bad at his job, though completely sober, didn't register with plenty of Americans. And McDowell was not the only Union general to face such scrutiny because, frankly, whatever problems Northerners thought they had with McDowell, they paled in comparison to those that accompanied General Joseph Hooker. After Hooker took command of the Army of the Potomac in December 1862, his drinking was much discussed. And to be clear, unlike McDowell, Hooker drank plenty of concoctions stronger than watermelon. He allowed whiskey rations to be distributed to his soldiers as well. And in early 1863, the Confederate press in Richmond suspected that Hooker's surname originated from his ability to hook a bottle. So talented a drinker was he that the Temperance Society people once talked of employing him to destroy all the ardent spirits within 50 miles around. Precious little liquor would have been left for any other drunkard after Joe had gotten his swig at the bottles, the paper continued. This, concluded the Richmond Dispatch, was the reason that Hooker had been given command of the Army of the Potomac. The Union soldiers, who were much demoralized by heavy drinking, would be restored to sobriety with Hooker in command. The general would drink all the whiskey himself. Obviously, it was bad enough that Confederates were poking fun at the most prominent general among the Federals. But the problem became incredibly serious after the Army of the Potomac was routed at Chancellorsville. Artillery officer Charles Wainwright explained that nearly all are very bitter on Hooker, and many accuse him of being openly drunk. Wainwright, for his part, thought Hooker had shown no signs of intoxication during the battle, but that did not stop every tongue in the army from wagging its fastest. Captain Francis Adams Donaldson swore he witnessed the general during the heat of battle guzzling wine instead of attending his duties. The Union defeat at Chancellorsville would be placed among the other thousands of disasters wrought by rum, according to Donaldson. And more than that, Donaldson reasoned that Hooker was of no further use to the cause because the soldiers had lost confidence in his ability to lead them into battle without needlessly risking their lives. This gossip reached Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, who spent weeks after the battle trying to determine whether or not Hooker was drunk during the fight. No one in the War Department could corroborate the stories, but Welles expressed much relief when Hooker was replaced by Meade in June 1863, as he suspected that liquor was the cause of the sudden paralysis which befell the army at Chancellorsville. Hooker's removal did not squelch suspicion surrounding his character. Americans needed a place to lay blame for the defeat. And prolific temperance reformer Henry Ward Beecher cranked up the rumor mill at a meeting of the National Temperance League in England by accusing Hooker of drunkenness. His comments were subsequently picked up by the New York Independents, and Congress launched an inquiry into the matter. When pressed for more information, Beecher became cagey. He refused to reveal his sources, and it left Congress to question the Union officers about Hooker's frame of mind during the battle. And his fellow officers closed rank. If Hooker was drunk, none of them was going to admit it. Daniel Sickles, Alfred Pleasanton, and Daniel Butterfield all testified to Hooker's sobriety, although Pleasanton noted that his whole manner was of that of a sick person. Butterfield went further, comparing the allegations that trailed Hooker to those that had plagued McDowell. The accusations had to be based in malice upon the general principle that when a man attains a high position, people are always found to carpet him and endeavor to pull him down. Informally, though, other officers suggested that while Hooker was probably sober at Chancellorsville, it might have been unusual. In fact, Carl Schurz suggested that it may have been, or Hooker may have been, unaccustomed to sobriety, so much that it affected his thinking, that his brain had failed to work because he had not given it the stimulus to which it had been habituated. It's more likely that Hooker had been concussed by artillery, but that wasn't discussed. What is interesting about the case of Chancellorsville, I think, is that one of the men who did blunder for the Federals was Oliver Otis Howard, that temperance general we discussed earlier. He was commanding the 11th Corps, comprising mostly German-American troops, and they were destroyed by Stonewall Jackson. Howard's soldiers were accused of cowardice. They had their patriotism questioned, but Howard escaped the fallout, and temperance reformers completely overlooked any role he might have had in the blunder. But Hooker, whose character was already questioned, took the brunt of the gossip. He ended up resigning as commander of Army of the Potomac, but went on to serve as a successful Corps commander in Tennessee. And Confederates had their own version of Joseph Hooker, so to speak. Jubal Early. He fell short of moral perfection, I suppose we could say. He had a fondness for women, for apple brandy, and for colorful language. And like Hooker, rumors of heavy drinking followed Early throughout the war, and soldiers under his command knew that he tacitly approved of their drinking. Early's habits caught up with him in 1864 after Confederates under his command were defeated at the Third Battle of Winchester in Virginia. Politicians throughout the South began to call for an investigation into the general's drinking habits. And there wasn't much hard evidence, please forgive my pun. Early, nevertheless, launched an impassioned defense of his character and his skills as a commander. He asked his friend to publish a letter in the Richmond Enquirer refuting the charges of his being very drunk at Winchester. God only knows, emphasized Early, how faithfully I have labored for success in this campaign. The accusation may have shaken the usually hard-living Early. A month later, a Confederate general reported that Early lately refused to receive a barrel of whiskey as a present, and that the general had been seen accompanying a lady to church. It was too little, too late. With rumors of Early's drunken defeat swirling through the Virginia countryside, Lee had no choice but to relieve him of his command in March 1865. So we've covered a lot of ground in this talk, assessing public perceptions of the drinking habits of numerous prominent generals. And at this point, I'm not really sure there's much left to bring up when it comes to drinking and Civil War generals, except perhaps, maybe, to talk a little bit about Ulysses S. Grant. And I'm not sure that there is any Civil War general whose drinking came or has come under so much scrutiny as Grant's. Rumors of drunkenness followed him throughout his military career, starting with a supposed bout when he was stationed on the Pacific coast in the 1850s. It purportedly contributed to his resignation so that he could avoid court-martial. Nearly 10 years later, when Grant began to move up the ranks of the Union Army, his suspected drinking once again became fodder for gossip. In early 1862, when Grant was promoted to Major General, Stephen Minot Weld worried that even though Grant was a man of great energy and a laborious worker, Weld also knew from another unnamed general that Grant was just as likely to be drunk in the gutter as to be sober. The rumors were spurred on in part by conflicts with Generals Henry Halleck and John McClernand. Grant also suffered from migraine headaches, and he did drink to control the pain. When he drank, it's pretty clear he didn't hold his liquor well. But his wife, Julia, and his friend, John Rawls, successfully encouraged Grant to avoid spirits. Often during the war, Julia stayed with Grant at his headquarters, where she not only could nurse him through his headaches, but also quieted the rumor mill. Under his wife's domestic influence, civilians believed, the general could not become intoxicated. Nevertheless, people continued to speculate about his habits. After businessman John Murray Forbes voiced his suspicions of Grant's drunkenness, New York Evening Post editor William Cullen Bryant insisted that Grant was a temperate man and that he had a batch of written testimonials to that effect. No one close to the general had seen him drink. After being sent by Edwin Stanton to monitor Grant's progress with the Army of the Tennessee in 1863, Charles A. Dana concluded, despite accusations from McClernand, that Grant was sober, a claim Dana would maintain throughout and after the war. And whether Dana's observations were accurate or not, they carried significant weight. After hearing from Dana in August 1863 that Grant doesn't drink, diarist George Templeton Strong found himself increasingly convinced of Grant's sobriety. By the end of 1864, Strong and his fellow U.S. Sanitary Commission officers, who were stationed near Petersburg, were firmly convinced that Grant had a singleness of purpose, an entire devotion to his work, and a remarkable ability to work well with other officers. Northern temperance reformers needed convincing. They were nervous about Grant. If a patriotic leader had to be sober to achieve victory and national salvation, a drunkard at the head of the armies signaled disaster. And Grant perplexed them. When it came to figuring out his drinking habits, reformers relied on eyewitness accounts and battlefield evidence. According to a staff member, Major E.D. Osborne, whose assessment of Grant's character was printed in the Journal of the American Temperance Union a few months after the capture of Vicksburg, Grant looked more like a chaplain than a general when he sat with his wife and his kids. The general embodied middle-class virtues. He was brave, cool to excess, always hopeful, and more pure and spotless in his private character than almost any man Osborne had ever known. Another correspondent offered a similar assessment in August 1864. Grant does not drink, does not swear, does not tell his plans, and does not have his picture taken. That part wasn't quite true. He was a model patriot, sharing hardship with his men, avoiding vices, possessing many of the qualifications necessary in a good general. If the assurances of those close to Grant did not convince Northern teetotalers of Grant's temperance, his military record spoke for itself. Reformers concluded that Grant had not been drunk during the Battle of Shiloh as alleged, because if he had been intoxicated, he never would have gained a victory. They had also been assured by one who was present with him all the time that the general had not allowed a drop of liquor to pass his lips. Those assurances were important, to be sure, and they set reformers' minds at ease, but the conclusions about Grant's character are important. When civilians had doubts about a man's drinking habits, they looked for proof of morality and victory. Using the argument often made by factory owners in the new industrial age, reformers addressed Grant directly and pointed out that he was tasked with guiding the vast machine of the army, a machine more complicated than any of the industrial factories, a machine that moved with perfect regularity, a machine comprised entirely of living, intelligent, conscious, and voluntary agents. Grant's job as a commander was to make the machine work to bring about victory. And unlike McDowell and Hooker, Grant passed the test by winning battle after battle. Therefore, he had to be sober. This perceived link between success and sobriety that we've observed in Civil War generals is important because these ideas trickle down through the ranks and actually out into society. Officers who drank were suspected of mishaps and at times accused of misusing the men in their commands. Enlisted men as well, who were not sober, were perceived to be a threat to their cause, whether that cause was Union or Confederate. Civilians who were drunk or otherwise participated in manufacturing or selling liquor were likewise endangering the nation. In short, people who drank anything, but especially people who drank too much, were bad Americans. And this idea continued after the war for decades, though it ebbed and flowed. Civil War veterans, for example, typically drank, and they were thought not to be pulling their weight in American society. Immigrants who drank were considered to be less American. And half a century later, this idea or these related ideas about drinking being a threat to the nation, they popped up in full force during World War I. And it was during a time of war, again, that these ideas ultimately were able to contribute to the 18th Amendment of national prohibition. But I believe that we see their origins in the Civil War. Thank you.